Hello and welcome to CDP Presents, our monthly webinar series. We're happy to have all of you with us here today. And if you've joined us before, welcome back. I'm Andy Santinello, Senior Military Behavioral Health Psychologist at the Center for Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University and a part of the CDP Presents team. This project is sponsored by the Uniformed Services University. However, the information or content and conclusions do not necessarily represent the official position or policy of, nor should any official endorsement be inferred on the part of USU, the Department of Defense, or the US government. Here's a good snapshot of some of the upcoming trainings we'll be offering in the next couple of months, which can be found under the training tab on the CDP's website. Did you miss last month's webinar debunking common misconceptions about sleep interventions? Well, never fear, we have you covered. You can find the recording on our archived webinars page. And if you attended and liked the webinar, please feel free to share it with colleagues and friends. CDP is excited to continue to talk about and invite folks to check out our podcast, Practical for Your Practice. This biweekly podcast features stories, ideas, support, and actionable intel to empower providers to keep working towards implementing evidence-based practices with fidelity and effectiveness. And be sure to check out our latest podcast episode where we sit down. We're actually between seasons. We'll be starting season 2 soon. We're actually just in season 3, so we'll be just wrapping that up pretty soon. So if you haven't checked out our podcast, please do. All right, so to enhance your experience before I introduce our speaker today, I wanted to just take a moment to orient you to a few features of Zoom if you're not already familiar. That will hopefully enhance your experience of our training. So you may have entered the webinar in full screen mode, so please click on your screen and hit the escape key if you'd like to exit full screen mode. For the best user experience today, we recommend that you close all other programs on your computer. Any difficulties viewing materials during the presentation are likely due to internet connection issues. While I'm talking right now, please check the volume level on your computer or device and adjust as needed. Many participants will find it easier to hear the presentation by using headphones. Please note the chat feature, which you can find by hovering over the bottom of the screen. And I see a lot of folks have already found that, which is great. This is a fantastic place for you to enter questions and respond to questions that our speaker may pose, or even interact with other participants. Questions will be moderated and asked of the presenter in the final 5 to 10 minutes of our presentation today. Also, if you experience any technical difficulties, please type the problem in the chat pod, and someone from our tech support team will assist you. Please make sure that you send your text message to all panelists and attendees in the chat pod so that everyone can see your questions. This webinar series will be recorded and posted to the Center for Deployment Psychology website, along with any additional materials and references. Handouts for today's webinar can be found in your CE21 My Account page under this event. Finally, at the end of the webinar, our project manager, Mr. Micah Norgard, will provide information and instructions on how to obtain CEs. In order to obtain CE credit, you must attend the entire webinar and complete the webinar survey in CE21. Please note that for this webinar, we are offering American Psychological Association CE credits, which are acceptable to most state licensing boards for different mental health disciplines. Please be sure to check the requirements for your state and retain any documentation associated with this training. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Wyatt Evans. Wyatt R. Evans is a board-certified psychologist with the VA North Texas Healthcare System and assistant professor at UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas, Texas. He has supported DoD, VA, and NIH-funded research in the areas of trauma-focused treatment, moral injury, and resilience enhancement. Dr. Evans is a co-investigator and trainer for an in-progress study of psychological flexibility training with active duty service members. Dr. Evans has no financial interest to disclose. So it's my pleasure to hand over the mic to Dr. Evans.
Thank you very much, Andy. Happy to be here. Let's see, I'm going to advance these slides. So I'm pleased to be with you all today to talk about the goings-on in that program that Andy mentioned just there, the study of a psychological flexibility training model to enhance service resilience in service members. So I'll talk a little bit about the specifics of the study and the program, but I'm mostly going to focus on sort of the theory and the evolution of the science that led us to want to do this study and to develop this program. I have to start with some really important acknowledgements. So Dr. Alan Peterson and Eric Meyer are the co-PIs on the study, and I'll reference them again later. Drs. Brian Moore and Robin Walzer are key contributors to the study as well. The study is happening inside of the Strong Start Consortium and Consortium to Alleviate PTSD. So that's a massive team. So my thanks to all of them. And to the ACT for Military Special Interest Group of the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. I have to acknowledge that whole group because it is really our conversations and reflections that have contributed most significantly to the development of this training. So our agenda for today, we'll talk a little bit about resilience. We'll talk a little bit about psychological flexibility. I'll give you just a quick snapshot of some of the research support and the theoretical basis. And then I'll give you an overview of our psychological flexibility training program. We'll talk about the processes or mechanisms of change inside of that program. I'll give you some examples of some of the procedures we're using. And finally, a quick update on our development and implementation. And I will do my very best to save a few minutes for Q&A at the end. So let's start with resilience. What is resilience? Well, that is a good question. And it is not a question to which there is a consensus answer. Resilience research, resilience literature is evolving toward a consensus answer, and perhaps we'll talk a little bit about what that might be today. But in brief, there are over 100 different published definitions of resilience. Several of those definitions orient around sort of the resilient type, which is when we learn from stressful experiences and then acquire through that learning the necessary skills for successful stress coping. The idea being that once you acquire these skills, these response behaviors, you are resilient. And so one is then resilient by virtue of having acquired those skills. APA defines resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of stress. So the APA definition moves us in the direction of resilience as an outcome. It also begins to highlight the relevance of process, the ongoing process, but the focus here is on the successful adaptation, sort of on the other side of, or even in the midst of adversity, trauma, tragedy, etc. More recent definitions have really focused in on that idea of process. In this definition, Stanton and colleagues describe it as a dynamic process by which individuals do utilize protective factors and resources. So some of those learned traits, perhaps, or some of those inborn traits, to achieve an advantageous outcome. That component is maintained amid stress. The emphasis again here, though, is on the process of utilizing those resources to achieve that outcome. It is neither the resources or the outcome. It's the process of utilizing the resources to achieve the outcome. Something worth really noticing today is that there are many resilience promoting traits and behaviors. That is, there are many correlates of resilience, personality factors, as well as learned qualities and behaviors and traits. However, we'll see in just a moment that despite that robust literature describing, myriad traits and behaviors, we still cannot particularly well successfully predict resilience or who will become resilient. So let's talk now about the state of resilience science. And I'm using a very recent book by a renowned resilience researcher, George Bonanno, to kind of provide a simple resource for everybody for understanding kind of the state of science. So a few key take-home points from Bonanno's work and recent publication is, though we can identify, and this is what I was alluding to just a moment ago, though we can identify correlates of resilience, we can't predict very well who will be resilient. So why that's important to the practice of resilience enhancement or resilience enhancement training is that the attempts to enhance resilience that are focusing on one or even several of these correlates are likely going to be ineffective. And that is a lot of our training to date. Bonanno and Burton describe the fallacy of uniform efficacy to help us understand this a little bit better. So key to what we'll be talking about today is this point. Strategy effectiveness, that is response or behavioral coping effectiveness, is highly dependent on the fit with the situational demands, the context, the situation, the environment. So these quote unquote predictors of resilience really just show modest effects because they're not beneficial in every situation or at every time. I would submit that a lot of us who are in clinical practice already know this. We know it firsthand from our work with perhaps it's military veterans for a lot of us here, or active duty service members. And we know that they have a robust and effective set of coping strategies that served them well once upon a time that are no longer serving them well now. So I think in some ways, this is the research literature catching up with what is sort of well understood in clinical practice. So, and I'm just going to quote directly from Bonanno here, the mechanism that underlines resilience must involve some sort of adjudication process, some way of working out moment by moment what the best response might be, and then engaging in that response. So Bonanno proposes that mechanism is a flexible self-regulation. For those who are already familiar with psychological flexibility, specifically the psychological flexibility model that underpins acceptance and commitment therapy, you might be starting to hear something else here. I certainly did as I was reading this for the first time. Before I get to that, though, let me just show you how Bonanno sort of depicts this flexible self-regulation model, or this flexibility sequence. So there's a stressor. The individual evaluates both the demands and the opportunities. This he describes as context sensitivity. I'll say more about that in a moment. Then there's the selection of a regulatory or coping strategy. Then one has to, which is selected from a repertoire of coping behaviors. And then one has to monitor and, if needed, modify by observing and sort of noticing the feedback that is coming after the implementation of the selected regulatory strategy. By monitoring that feedback, one knows to either adjust the strategy, going back to that repertoire, maintaining the strategy, or to cease the strategy altogether. So again, if you're familiar with, on the therapy sides, acceptance and commitment therapy, if you're familiar with the psychological flexibility model, you too are probably feeling or noticing a sense of parallel here. So let me make that point. Psychological flexibility has been defined this first time by Steve Hayes and colleagues as the ability to contact the present moment more fully via greater conscious awareness and intention, and to change or persist in behavior in a way that is consistent with personally chosen values. There are components of that already that I hear similarities to, and I'm going to flesh those out in a moment. Put more simply, psychological flexibility is the pursuit of valued goals despite the presence of distress. So here you can see on the left the hexaflex model, which is a core component of acceptance and commitment therapy, case conceptualization. And on the right is just sort of a breakdown of the psychological inflexibility processes, and on the right, psychological flexibility processes. And I'm going to unpack all of those as we go here. So I'll move ahead. But let's take a deeper look at that flexibility sequence that Bonanno proposed in his 2021 book, and in many papers, pretty prolific publisher. So this is mechanisms of resilience enhancement from the resilience literature. So there are three components of the flexibility sequence. Context sensitivity is working out demands of a particular situation and choosing a regulatory strategy that will best meet the specific challenges we're facing in that moment. So that is being aware of the context, the specific situational demands of that unique context, and being able to distinguish that context from other contexts, where perhaps other coping strategies would be more effective. So first is being aware of context. Second is then having a large repertoire. In this case, the set of regulatory strategies we are able to use effectively. And finally is feedback monitoring, which is when we ask ourselves, is it working? And then we either continue, cease, or adjust, or even replace strategies as needed. What got me so excited was reading this and then comparing it with the mechanisms of resilience enhancement from the psychological flexibility side, which actually Andy and I had just articulated in a presentation shortly before I got a hold of The End of Trauma, Bonanno's book, in the following year. The parallel is, the language is identical in some cases. So we submitted, and this is, we don't own this. Psychological flexibility has been thoroughly researched for decades now. So I put a paper that I have in press right now as a reference, but it's just an example. There are many other examples of this concept and discussion of this concept out there. But we said that resilience enhancement from the psychological flexibility perspective involves selecting the most adapted behavior for task completion, which is essentially very adeptly selecting the most helpful behavior for values-aligned living and values-based task or goal completion. We select that adaptive behavior from a contextually sensitive behavioral repertoire, which is a broad range of response behaviors. These can include things like acceptance or reappraisal, perseverance, or even discontinuation. So a broad range of response behaviors sufficient to allow effective action across situations. And finally, the ability to refine this through practice or training, assessing response effectiveness from a diffused self. There's the ACT language showing up. I'll unpack that for those who aren't as familiar. So as to make necessary adaptations or to persist. So you can hear the language of psychological flexibility, those definitions I presented in the 2 slides ago. And you can also see the parallel with Bonanno's language in terms of the flexibility sequence. In case it wasn't, abundantly clear, let me just put it side by side. Context sensitivity, it's actually sort of crossed, but context sensitivity and contextually sensitive behavioral repertoire. repertoire, and selecting the most adaptive behavior for task completion, and then the refining through training and practice, feedback monitoring. That one's not a perfect parallel, but I think we can see that there's quite a bit of similarity there. So all in all, this sort of convergence of two separate literatures, completely separate, not separate sciences, but separate lines of thinking, almost completely distinct groups researching these issues, converged in the same place at approximately the same time to discover that this is the proposed mechanism for resilience enhancement. So just briefly on the research, why psychological flexibility as a training model? So as of Monday, I double checked Monday as I was finishing up these slides. There are 949 published, peer-reviewed, randomized controlled trials, RCTs, not RTCs. I work for the VA. If you work for the VA, you know why I got that confused. Published, peer-reviewed, randomized controlled trials of ACT, which is the treatment or training model that facilitates and cultivates psychological flexibility. Importantly, ACT is not just a therapy. ACT is not just a treatment for psychological disorders. It has been demonstrated to improve work performance, job satisfaction, training outcomes. It's also been shown to reduce work stress, absenteeism, burnout, and job-related errors. Multiple studies have demonstrated that the intervening on psychological flexibility increases pain tolerance, increases levels of performance on physical exercise tasks, and that's a really blossoming area of ACT-related research if you're interested. Improves group functioning, enhances functioning in collaborative workplace settings, and develops crisis-resilient change managers. So if you can kind of understand the context in which we might want to implement a training to enhance resilience, you can see that all of these things would be crucial. The most important point to make here is that psychological flexibility training, or one might say sort of ACT for resilience, it kind of depends on how you want to think about this, is an evidence-based intervention with broad and robust array of tools and techniques for enhancing the very qualities necessary for resilience: context sensitivity, repertoire, and then feedback or adaptability. And adaptability is the word you'll start hearing me use more regularly throughout the rest of the presentation as I sort of segue into some of the language that we actually use in the current version of the training. Allow me to just highlight, if I can, without getting bogged down, highlight some of the previous or existing resilience enhancement training models. Full disclosure, I'm not prior service, I'm not current service. I'm not thoroughly and comprehensively versed in the existing resilience training models, but in the research that I have done, a couple of them have come to the surface as relevant and interesting. So Battle Mind, which as I understand it is no longer implemented, entailed pre-deployment training on how to be resilient in the deployed environment, and then follow-up training upon return that encouraged service members to actually identify behaviors in themselves and others that were adaptive in the deployment environment, but might not be so helpful in non-deployed settings. What's interesting is, if indeed this one's not so popular or not even implemented anymore, is that they were on the right track, at least from the perspective that I'm offering today. They were on the right track in that they were super focused on context, on environmental differences in the effectiveness of response strategies. Master resilience training, which is sort of nested within the comprehensive soldier fitness program, is the current resilience training model for the US Army. And MRT focuses on training soldiers to recognize maladaptive cognitions or problematic patterns of thinking and how to change them. And this is actually the control for our study, is this sort of training as usual, if you will, which is currently the MRT program. For those who are familiar with sort of the traditional CBT model, you might hear sort of that being emphasized in the identification of unhelpful thoughts and behaviors. And while that's not bad or wrong, CBT is highly effective. There are limitations to this in that it's not focusing specifically on context sensitivity, and it focuses on sort of one subset of potential response behaviors, the change-based cognitive reappraisal behaviors. Other limitations just to the literature and study, or lack thereof, of the existing resilience training programs today, is that they've largely been focused on developing resilience in austere environments, and less so focused on what resilience may mean, what resilience may look like in non-deployed environments, certainly in the contexts that people will operate in even after their military service is complete. It's also been highly focused on identifying and addressing maladaptive cognition, stress management, and problem-solving strategies. So it's been focused on that one subset of potential coping strategies. And in many cases, they are based on clinical interventions adapted without sort of a cohesive or sound theory of resilience enhancement, or attention to overarching processes or mechanisms of change. So in that way, the foundation may be a little bit shaky, even if there's some relevant skills that are meaningful, useful, helpful. They're not founded on a cohesive theory that allows for comprehensive study or sound research. So let's move into talking about the actual training. So one of the things that we're struggling, admittedly, and making progress in doing, is adapting the language, the academic language, as well as the clinical or treatment-focused language that we find in a lot of our psychological flexibility programs, which are typically treatment programs. So one of the little shortcuts that we've come up with as far as sort of this resilience equation, if you will. And so our emphasis from day one is that resilience is arsenal times adaptability. So arsenal might translate to repertoire, but we wouldn't use the word repertoire. The adaptability is then the recognition or the context sensitivity, and then the feedback piece of noticing the effectiveness of the selected skill or tool or behavioral from the arsenal and making adjustments as needed. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but it puts into a nice, simple context or nutshell the key components of resilience enhancement. It's not just developing some skills like hunting the good stuff. There's more to it than that. There's the adaptability, the context sensitivity piece, and that's what we focus a lot on. Again, for those who are familiar with sort of ACT as an intervention for psychological disorders or for existing distress or dysfunction, you might be familiar with the concept of control as the problem. So in ACT as an intervention, we start by raising folks' awareness of the unworkability of their experiential avoidance or their control strategies, the control of their internal experiences. We thought perhaps it might be misinterpreted, but interpreted in an unhelpful way if we said control is the problem. So we have tweaked it slightly, and we're emphasizing rigidity as the problem. And then we often hear in ACT acceptance being the alternative to control, acceptance as a solution. Not a solution that rids us of our unwanted internal experiences, but a solution to the problem of control. Acceptance is often a word that is, it elicits a particular reaction in folks, some folks. And so we are emphasizing adaptability. We're departing a little bit from the model, but we think it's a fair sort of revision. And it gets us to the point we're trying to make. So the current form of the training is a 2-day training. It is something that we are revising as we go, adopting feedback and adapting. Yay, adaptation. The current form is 2 days. The first day is focused on something we're calling psychological situational awareness. And this day emphasizes context sensitivity and adaptability. And then in the second day, we actually get into the flexibility skills training. This is where we're teaching coping skills, teaching effective skills for navigating stressful circumstances. Currently, we're not emphasizing the cognitive reappraisal skills, the change-focused skills, although I think there's room for us to have the best of both worlds and emphasize those as well, train those as well. We're emphasizing, though, the acceptance skills, the openness, awareness, and engagement skills. And I'll share more about that in a moment. So this is another place where we're sort of tweaking our language. We're wanting to make it as digestible, as clear, as accessible as possible. So if anybody has feedback, I'm super open to that. So is the whole team. But day 1, psychological situational awareness. Day 2, flexibility skills training. Back to the Hexaflex model and sort of nestled inside of the 3 pillars of psychological flexibility. Again, for those who aren't quite as familiar, there are 6 core processes inside of acceptance and commitment therapy or psychological flexibility training, or there's also an ACT training, AC training out there. They include acceptance and diffusion, which fall in the openness pillar. Flexible attention to the present moment, contact with the present moment, and self as context, which is an awareness of an observing self and a departure from an over-identification with an over-conceptualized self. And these are centered inside of the either centered or aware pillar. And then the engagement pillar, which includes values clarification, and committed action. Just another place where we've made some tweaks. We emphasize the centered or aware pillar as the posture of psychological flexibility. And if you're familiar with sort of some of the mindfulness practices that focus on centering awareness on an intentionally chosen target in the present moment, contacting a sense of self as context, as a stabilizing place from which we can see our experiences unfolding, the idea of posture begins to make sense. We describe the openness pillar as the attitude of resilience and the engaged pillar as the target. So you'll see a little bit later, we'll talk about getting positive ID on what matters. So we talk about personal values, and we also talk about personal values in relation to, in the case of our study, Army core values, but the core values of any branch of service. Recognize this may be a little bit small, but I just wanted to include it for awareness. It's also in the paper I referenced earlier. We just wanted to flesh out, as we're thinking about these 6 core processes, and this is more at the conceptual level. This is not something that we would necessarily share inside of the training. In this way, it would be communicated. But we think about flexible contact with the present moment as having an impact on resilience enhancement through its enhanced environmental awareness, increasing intentional responding, conscious intentional responding, and decrease ineffective reactivity. Acceptance, willingness involve reducing the disabling effects of unwanted internal experiences, promoting access to that full behavioral repertoire. And it actually expands the repertoire with a myriad of new skills. Really, I kind of think of that as the whole other half of coping skills. It's probably an oversimplification to think of it as just two buckets, but I think about change-focused coping skills and acceptance-focused coping skills. And this training really fills this bucket over here, which is otherwise left kind of empty sometimes. I won't read all of these at y'all, but cognitive diffusion helps us counter the negative effects of buying into unhelpful thoughts. Self as context actually mitigates the impact of stressful events on our sense of self. Values helps us simply orient our actions across contexts toward effectiveness, vitality, meaning, and purpose. And committed action also helps decrease unhelpful reactivity and continuously increase our behavioral repertoire. So I'll spend just a few moments with each of the 6 core processes and give you a sense of how we describe those in the training. So when we talk about present moment context, it's sort of an attention training. And I used to just call it attention training, but that felt like it was selling the process short. So at the risk to avoid getting too wordy, I now simply describe it as attention training plus. This involves awareness, centeredness, and flexibility. Awareness is a fully conscious awareness that puts us in touch with the reality of what's around us. What is, not necessarily what our mind says it is. And without this awareness, we're missing vital information about the context and what resources we have available. And so to illustrate this, we might do a mindfulness type exercise where we take time to tune into our 5 senses and notice that there's a lot going on within and around us that is going unnoticed. And so we can then emphasize the importance of awareness as allowing us to notice the fullness of the situation and environment around us, and also to notice the full range of resources available within us. Centeredness is emphasized as the groundedness which is necessary to make intentional selections based on that current context. And then without centeredness, we find ourselves being reflexive, responding in an impulsive way that actually perpetually narrows our options. So to illustrate and practice this, we walk through a simple breath-focused mindfulness exercise, which is not about calming down. It's not like diaphragmatic breathing, but it's about returning to the breath, intentionally selecting an attentional focus, and then returning intentionally each and every time the mind wanders. And finally, flexibility inside of present moment context is emphasized as being, from this flexible stance, our range of motion is greatest, and that's metaphorical. We're able to pivot into the most effective behavior from context to context. As we grow rigid in our stance and in our posture toward the present moment, we notice that we tend to respond to whatever's going on through the lens of that posture, of that perspective. And so we actually have folks get into a defensive posture and then take time to notice how they're feeling inside of their body, how they're feeling emotionally. And then we adopt a very open posture. and notice differences. We also take time to notice how free we are to move in an effective way from that more open posture. From there, we move into self as context, which is not necessarily discussed as self as context. But to this crowd, I wanted to make the connection with the psychological flexibility processes. We kind of describe this as the perspective of resilience. So military training and culture often narrows the sense of self, and this is not unintentional. We have statements like soldier 24/7, or once a Marine, always a Marine. And in some ways, these are intended to control or create predictability in a large group. It's intended to support mission effectiveness. And yet, I think it can diminish individual effectiveness across contexts. So I'm not saying there's not a place and a time for really homing in on a sense of self as a soldier, or as a Marine, as whatever, and that's all well and good. But then we want to be able to zoom back out from that and reconnect with a sense of self that is more than just that specific identity or that specific role. Over identification narrows the sense of self, and which hinders responsiveness to context. It may make one highly effective and honed in one context, and it dramatically decreases effectiveness in other contexts. Developing this perspective, contacting this sense of self, allows for psychological and environmental situational awareness. We see things as they are, not as our minds say they are, fully and unfiltered, with awareness of the one who is seeing, and thus the one who's free to make conscious choices about how to show up. So growing awareness of and contact with this enduring self diminishes the potential repertoire narrowing impact of temporary experiences, releases psychological limiters imposed by an over-identified or a conceptualized self, and actually increases our ability to make fully conscious decisions and responses. And I included, this is actually a slide that we show in the training, where we make those points precisely, that this perspective releases psychological limiters, decreases the impact of temporary, even if aversive experiences, and increases our ability to make fully conscious decisions. And thus far, the point that these pictures are making has been very well received. The point being that I reject the picture on the left. What matters most is how you see yourself, and this little kitty is seeing himself as a lion. I would submit that that has its place in time, so I guess I shouldn't say that I reject it completely. I contextualize it. It has its place in time, sort of self-inflating. It's not the word I want to use, but it's the best I've got at the moment. Self-inflating self-talk. It has its place in time, but we also want the ability to see ourselves as we are. If we are a little kitty, then recognize that we're a little kitty. In some places and ways, we may not be a big, strong lion. And being able to connect with that being okay, and in fact being important, has actually resonated really well thus far. So then we move from self as context to diffusion, and point to the perils of automaticity in some contexts. I know there's a lot on this slide. It was all information I wanted to share, and then I'll just kind of distill it down. First of all, fusion isn't all bad. Fusion gets a bad rap when we're talking about it inside of acceptance and commitment therapy, but it has its place in time. There's some really positive places and times for it, like when you're reading a good book, watching a thrilling movie, and also when you're operating inside of terrifying, chaotic situations in which higher level thinking goes offline. That automatic responding can be life-saving. And actually, there's some research that shows that essentially not thinking too much enhances our physical performance. One of the key points that we highlight is that rigidity around rules that we have for ourselves or that our culture has for us, especially around toughness and performance, is potentially problematic, even if it is characteristic of military culture. It has its place in time. Rules help large groups organize behavior. But rigidity around those rules, fusion with those rules, narrows our repertoire to what fits within inside that box, and thus limits our access to anything that may be outside of that box. It reduces context sensitivity. It narrows our guideposts for action from broader values, which we'll talk about in a moment, to specific tasks, specific situationally specific tasks and goals, and then limits the expansion of our behavioral responses. Current training programs, and this is something that we share without bashing the current training programs, we highlight the fact that the current training programs are largely comprised of cognitive interventions that can inadvertently perpetuate a toxic quality of fusion with thoughts. This belief or rule that we must defeat or at least distract ourselves from unhelpful thoughts in order to perform and live well. And if and when that's feasible and comes at little to no cost, sweet, we're all about that. But when that's infeasible or when that comes at too great of a cost, we want to be able to shift to a different response. And quite simply, I think that the cool thing about intervening on psychological flexibility is that distancing from our thinking is okay. And so is getting right up next to our thoughts. But we want to make sure that we're doing that in a contextually sensitive and adaptable manner. So just make sure that the intention is set and the context is clear. What's going to be the most workable way of showing up to the moment? From diffusion, we move into acceptance, and we talk about really embracing the suck. So acceptance is both a behavior, a tool, a skill, and is also a process by which full access to behavioral repertoire is maintained. So acceptance, the willingness or the openness allows us to continue seeing and engaging with the full range. And then acceptance is also a specific skill inside of that range that may be the most workable way of showing up to a stressor or an internal experience or an environmental circumstance. We have these phrases such as embrace the suck that are sometimes misconstrued to mean suppress feelings, banish our thoughts, or be tougher, stronger, better. And on the other side, the idea of acceptance or willingness or openness can be misconstrued as representing concession, weakness, laziness, lack of skill or grit. And so this is something that we work to unpack and dispel some of these misconceptions. And in some ways, we directly challenge sort of misconstrual or misunderstanding of words like acceptance or openness, while at the same time, we try not to get bogged down in that by having other language that we're able to engage as needed. Sometimes, and this is something we want to emphasize in so much as we don't want to sound rigid ourselves or be rigid ourselves, sometimes quashing unhelpful emotions and thoughts is an appropriate strategy. A short-term solution that is just limited to those contexts in which survival is the primary objective. So in treatment, with my veterans with PTSD, you know, we'll often talk about how under fire, you know, if the guy on your left, the guy on your right goes down, I don't care if he was your childhood best friend. You can't pause to feel your feelings and cry it out. That's going to put you and the other people you're with in danger. You need to suppress and shut down those emotions so that you can keep fighting. However, as we all well know, emotional suppression is not a workable strategy in the long term or in a majority of life contexts outside of these life-threatening situations. So we emphasize that the rigid application of control-based strategies across contexts actually hinders our performance and causes our suffering. And that the inflexible application of even these positive approaches, positive in a particular context, like stoicism or meticulousness, alertness, preparedness, uniformity, they can actually lead to suffering and limit our effectiveness in other contexts. In addressing values and values clarification as a core psychological flexibility process, we point to values as supporting our continuity and flexibility. We have a conversation about getting positive ID on what matters and then moving toward that thing. We do a fairly standard values clarification exercise and then process that both in the context of sort of a standard processing of what showed up, how was the process for you, but also, you know, where do you notice, again, in our case, the Army core values showing up or not showing up for you? And how do we understand having unique individual values while also having these shared cultural values? We help folks understand domains versus values versus goals. Oftentimes, and we see this in treatment settings, suffering shows up not because there's values unclarity, not because folks don't have values-based goals and aren't taking committed actions, but because there's an imbalance across life domains. They're engaging a value of loving or caring or compassion at work, but not with their family, not with themselves, not in the community. And so that imbalance results in suffering. Again, certain aspects of being in the military lend themselves to an imbalance, an overemphasis on the work domain and an underemphasis on other domains. In a deployed environment, especially in a combat zone, combat environment, we have fewer domains. We don't sometimes have a family that we even get to talk to or that we rarely get to talk to. Sources and opportunities of self-care are quite limited. And so in that context, it may be okay to overemphasize values-based action into that domain of work. But as we transition into a different environment, a different phase of life or what have you, there needs to be a redistribution. So this is kind of a forward-thinking part of the conversation, in so much as what we're looking at is long-term resilience here. So we actually do a values bullseye exercise where we help folks kind of check in with where they are at that moment. And we introduced language of values-aligned living. Thus far, and I'll mention this in a moment, all of our participants have been officers or NCOs, most of them mid to late career. So they are leaders. And our hope is that they will take this language of values-aligned living back to their soldiers, and it will become a part of the way that they talk to each other. And last but not least, we have committed action, where we talk about doing what works and doing what matters. So when we start the section on committed action, We emphasize that all these previous processes or skills, we don't get bogged down in language of skill versus process versus procedure, which is important for us in our conceptualization and our theory, less so as a practical matter for them. So these previous skills are engaged in the service of overcoming psychological barriers that can impede committed action. And so our emphasis is that over time and with consistent engagement, committed action facilitates the context-sensitive expansion of our behavioral repertoire. Another point of emphasis is that while values do tend to be enduring over time and across contexts, the ways in which values are most effectively engaged varies across contexts. I think this is probably one of the most important points, and it's been made at several points in this presentation. It would have been made at several points in the training up to this point. But a limited repertoire of even values-based actions likely leads to context insensitivity and sort of a myopic focus on short-term goals disconnected from broader enduring values. So like integrity is the example we use. And it's likely to show up differently in garrison, in a firefight, in traffic, and at the family dinner table. And we actually evoke a conversation, different contexts where integrity might matter, and then we have a conversation about what integrity looks like in those different contexts. So the point made here is that resilience is engaged via the willingness and adaptability to change tacks while maintaining the values aligned course. This is that feedback monitoring piece. So I just want to say a little bit about training and the training development and evaluation. And then I have done something that I almost never do, which is actually save ample time for questions and maybe some answers. Just want to highlight again, the co-PIs of the project, Drs. Alan Peterson and Eric Meyer. We've had 2 training cohorts so far, and for context, we got this grant like right before the pandemic hit, and everything came to a screeching halt. And ultimately, it completely changed the way we were able to implement the training. So we have been as flexible as humanly possible. I think we're all pretzels at this point, in fact. But we have had 2 training cohorts. And we have another one upcoming, probably beginning of 2023. As I mentioned a moment ago, participants to date have been mostly mid-career Army NCOs and officers. We are currently exploring additional training sites. So our current training site is Fort Hood here in Texas. And we're currently looking into other training sites so that we can expand, so we can gather more data, implement more trainings, have more participants, but so that we can also expand to gather importantly qualitative feedback from a diverse group of participants who kind of represent different areas of the Army. Our participant feedback to this point has largely been positive. I don't have any quantitative data for you yet, but our participants have been largely complimentary of the program. And the number one takeaway so far is that this needs to be implemented sooner. Our original intent was to actually implement this training with recruits, not with mid to late career leaders. So, we're on the same page as our participants here, but we were flexible inside of the pandemic, and this is where we are. But the number one feedback is we need to implement this sooner so that folks are actually sort of acculturated to the idea of context sensitivity and adaptability, so that folks don't, by virtue of really leaning into a particular context, that is a young soldier or a young service member of any sort, grow rigid or myopic or fused or over-identified with a particular conceptualized self early on, and then have to be pulled back out of that. If we could implement this sort of psychological flexibility, or rather cultivate psychological flexibility sooner rather than later, that would set folks up to be resilient across operational contexts, but also hopefully once they leave the military and are operating in a whole new set of contexts. So let me say that I would be more than happy to receive emails with questions. Like I said, I'm actually interested if anybody has thoughts about some of the language that we're using or just suggestions. Like I said, this has been a sort of a meeting of the minds, a collaboration among many people, those who are directly implementing the study and not. So I welcome feedback, I welcome questions, and hopefully there are some questions for us to discuss now. Otherwise, I think Andy and I are just going to chat for everybody's viewing pleasure.
Not a ton of questions, although you did get an invitation by one of our participants to look into maybe some opportunities to do some of the work you've been talking about in Hawaii. So that doesn't sound terrible. You might want to reach out to that person.
Relative to Fort Hood, Texas, the great place, yeah, maybe so.
If you need somebody to sort of spot you or carry your binder or something, I can go.
All right. Are there any questions that have been dropped into the chat or that are coming in now that we could take some time to discuss?
So folks have been mostly sort of attending to the presentation. I haven't seen a lot of questions. I'm just kind of scrolling back through chat.
Okay.
Oh, here are a couple. So
Oh, can I pick one that I'm saying here real quick?
yeah, please do.
I'm going to jump in with the how willing is the military culture? Is it ready for this kind of change? That has been some of the feedback that we've gotten as well. Is that a part of what we're pointing to here is the need for a pretty substantial culture shift. And I wholeheartly agree. As for the readiness, I think that varies across branches, across bases, across parts of the world, across different MOSs and stuff like that. But I think, yeah, one of the things that we're pointing to is sort of a culture shift that is away from rigidity, away from a narrow prioritization of toughness and stoicism. We teach those skills, we teach those tools, they serve a purpose in a certain place and time, but not all places and all times. So I don't know how you intervene on culture directly, but perhaps by intervening on the resilience training structure and concept in this way, we begin to affect some culture shift as well. That would be a personal hope anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I love that question, and it's sort of interesting because so much of what we do as mental health professionals, at least psychologists and social workers, maybe less so in terms of marriage and family therapists who probably, and couples therapists who are maybe a little bit more systems focused, is we focus very much on resilience and psychological health as being something on the individual level. And that question about sort of culture and working towards creating a culture that maybe looks at resilience differently is a really interesting systems type level question. And I was thinking about sort of a follow-up to that. And this is a little bit beyond the scope. So if you don't have any thoughts about this, that's fine. But I'm curious if you thought something like, the pro-social model, which is an ACT-based model, do you think that might have sort of anything to offer in addition to sort of the individual focused resiliency work that maybe you're using?
100%, 100%. In fact, when we were trying to be flexible and keep the project alive at the beginning of the pandemic, we considered shifting to a focus on pro-social training. We ended up sticking with the individual focus because that was sort of the focus of the grant. But I think that a combination of pro-social and individual psychological flexibility trainings could be the 1-2 punch necessary to affect pretty substantial change at the systems, group leadership, and individual levels.
So much work to be done. There's actually a bunch of questions now. So if you're willing to, I just sort of will feed them to you. How's that?
Sure, sounds great.
All right. So there was one question about the name of the program that you're developing itself, and some follow-up questions to that in terms of roles and qualifications of trainers at this point. And then, in terms of looking forward, what's the vision in terms of developing trainers and expanding the program as it sort of grows? So thoughts about that.
A good question, and it sort of interlocks with another one that I saw in the chat that I wanted to respond to about how this will be implemented, structured, rolled out in the future, if that's the direction it gets to head. I think that's an open question. I think it's one that we continue to discuss. We're sort of focused on the study at the moment, but the question is, how do we roll something like this out? The benefit of like the MRT program, for example, is that the focus is on training trainers who are in the units, who are able to provide localized training in a cost-effective way. The issue is that to a degree and in a way that waters down the potential potency of the training, not for all trainers, but for many. A lot of the folks that we talk to in sort of developing the program and in implementing the training find certain aspects of their existing training to be, I believe the word laughable has been used. And so all that to say, I am currently of the mind, and I reserve the right to change that mind, but I'm currently of the mind that it would be a worthwhile investment for the DoD to bring in resilience enhancement trainers who have the psychological health background necessary to implement this training at the highest potential level of potency possible. Perhaps there's a middle ground wherein we're not bringing in a bunch of psychological health professionals who are going to be expensive, but I don't know that we have that all figured out yet. Suffice to say for now that we know that the current arguably watered down model is not cutting it, as evidenced by the high levels of stress, dysfunction, suffering, suicide among service members and veterans. So it may be that we have to make a substantial investment in resilience enhancement to make any substantial change in that state of affairs. As for the implementation and structure, right now it's a 2-day training that is offered, one time. That was sort of the simplest, most straightforward model. We could feasibly implement. Might it be better implemented, at multiple time points? I think there's a good chance of that. I don't know if annual training is necessary, but something more than one time. I think the most important thing that we can do right now is implement this earlier on. And sort of to the point about the DoD evaluating the evidence-based interventions, that was the purpose of this grant. This is a DoD-funded study, and the DoD is interested in actually evaluating the evidence, behind these programs, which it really hasn't done in a robust, sound way with the existing programs.
And that's one of, I think, the challenges of studying something like a resilience enhancement program, because you're working with folks who haven't maybe experienced a stressful or even traumatic situation yet,
Mhm.
and seeing if that training helps sort of them weather the storm, so to speak. And I'm thinking about the Self-Help Plus research programs that have been going with the World Health Association, and some of the
Yeah,
research that's coming out around that. And so it's sort of interesting. There's all sorts of different models, and it's exciting that you're really sort of breaking the ground and exploring this particular one. Some
yeah,
other questions that I thought were kind of interesting, if you're willing to keep on going.
let's go.
So this I thought was kind of an interesting one, and I think it maybe speaks a little bit to what you were saying earlier about how cognitive reappraisal may actually be a fit for the model we're talking about, which might be a little bit different than what folks who are familiar with ACT were expecting to hear. So this question was wondering if the psychological flexibility training model you're talking about could actually be combined with other trainings, for example, integrating maybe some traditional cognitive behavior therapy components.
I would say sure, because um, cognitive reappraisal is an evidence-based process of change that has its place in time. Uh, so, like I said, we're focusing on filling the acceptance skills bucket in the training currently. I think there's no reason why we shouldn't also expand the change skills, the arousal reduction skills, again, the reappraisal skills bucket as well. Um, I'm not such an ACT purist that if I have a patient in my office who there is some aspect of their belief that they're articulating, the thought that they're describing, that is simply divorced from reality, and we could do some reality testing. We could do some simple, straightforward cognitive intervention, and they could find themselves, released from the suffering of consequent of fusion with that thought. Um, I'm going to do that, right? Now, chances are that's not the only thought leading to suffering. And so fusion is a diffusion is a process that then allows them to distance themselves from some of their other thoughts that may not be showing up in the room at that moment. Um, so I think these processes are all important, in so much as they all have their place in time. They all have a context where they are valuable and effective and helpful. And so I see no reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I think we can keep training these, more traditional CBT skills, if we're also emphasizing the other half of that repertoire, and we're emphasizing context sensitivity and adaptability.
That word training seems really key, and it sort of dovetails nicely with a comment that Robin just put in the chat. I also hear that we already do this on resilience for military leaders. Putting an untrained extra duty person up in front of a group with a slideshow is not resiliency training.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think it might be useful to just sort of emphasize, and I'd like you, if you would be willing to emphasize, what's different about the work that you're doing versus uh, you know, having somebody sort of talk about resiliency
Mhm.
training.
Yeah. Um, so in our original vision, uh, this was something that we did not in a classroom, but in something more of a training environment, um, not necessarily in the field per se, although there may be an application there as well. Um, Currently, we are doing it in a classroom, and the first day is more didactic in nature, in that we are teaching concepts. Um, The second day is more focused on skills development, those acceptance, openness, awareness, diffusion skills. So it's very experiential. We don't do nearly as much talking as I think happens in sort of these traditional, these existing resilience enhancement programs. There's a lot of hands-on work, as most ACT practitioners would expect. There's a lot of experiential exercises in day one as well, but especially in day two. I also think that there's a piece that is, I'm sure there are some excellent MRTs out there. Let me just say that. But I think that there's a piece that is, again, that untrained individual who is now up there with a slideshow attempting to train others, can't break down complex concepts in simple, digestible ways, can't respond effectively to questions, can't ask evocative questions. And so I think that there's a piece that makes this fundamentally different, that is just who is doing the training. In addition to how the training is unfolding, it's not something where folks are able to really check out, but they're quite engaged. I think there's room for, again, getting this out of a classroom setting, getting this into their daily life or operational environments. So I'm definitely open to thinking more about that. Like I said, that was our original vision, but I think it's different in so much as it's experiential, and the trainers are able to meet folks where they are. We're not delivering a prepackaged set of slides or concepts in a templated way.
Yeah, that experiential part is definitely the thing that I wanted to make sure folks knew that was a bit different when it comes to what it is that you're working on implementing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so there was a couple of questions, and you spoke to this a little bit, but I wanted to just kind of circle back to this because I think it's sort of important in thinking about the scope of the work you're doing. And the questions that I'm referring to had sort of pointed towards, placement of the training. Are we talking about even, might this be useful in sort of military academies? Could it be useful for folks in basic training who are just brand new to the military? Is this more suited for officers and maybe doing sort of a top-down dissemination approach? So that's one question. Where do you see, maybe now, but also in the future, that this type of training could be useful?
I am open to all ideas right now. I'm of the mind, and our team is of the mind, and our participants thus far have been of the mind that it would be most effective implemented early on. So possibly in academies, possibly in basic training, that it should be something that happens early on, and then something that is probably revisited from time to time, which maybe that's the happy medium. Maybe the training from psychological health professionals is what's happening earlier on, but then there's also training that is given to leaders, and it becomes sort of a top-down approach to maintaining psychological flexibility. It's just sort of a thought that just occurred to me. And so I think right now our hope is to move this up in terms of implementing it sooner, or with folks who are just entering, as opposed to folks who have been in for 10, 15 years and are already fairly flexible by virtue of the fact that they are really effective leaders. There's a conversation we had about that. But, so yes, early on, and then maybe maintained by leaders over time.
Yeah, those two aspects of it, getting folks exposed to these skills early on, and then having them reinforced and modeled maybe even over time. It reminds me a little bit, so I live in Baltimore, and I don't think this is unique to Baltimore, but there's been in some of the schools in the city an effort to teach young kids, mindfulness skills. And they've had some pretty interesting research. When you expose kids to mindfulness skills pretty early, it predicts all sorts of really great outcomes, like doing better in school, less behavioral problems, things like that. So, similarly, maybe as you're kind of suggesting, introducing service members to this really early in their career might downstream, predict more functionality and better outcomes for folks. And then if that's reinforced and modeled by, officers and more, senior veteran service members as well, then maybe you start to see some of that culture shift you were talking about.
Mhm. Yeah, I
So,
think I appreciate that example of the mindfulness in schools. I think that's a good comparison or parallel.
so there was another question. It's a little bit of a different one, and I don't know how you will feel about this, but I will pose it to you. I think it was Michelle asked, can you give an example? Yeah, it was Michelle asked, can you give an example of which experiential exercises might be included in that day two? So is there one that is sort of a core exercise that you do with folks that might really kind of illustrate the types of things that you're having people experience and kind of learn on that second day?
Yeah, so early on, when we're sort of working to understand sort of rigidity as the problem, we do the tug of war exercise, which I think is always really powerful in a group context and also gives language that they can then use for themselves, with each other, with their soldiers in the future about sort of dropping the rope. So we use the tug of war exercise. A little bit later in the day, we use eyes on, which I always find to be incredibly powerful and has been really interesting with this particular population. But eyes on really breaks down sort of a lot of our emotional control, experiential avoidance, demonstrates acceptance. Um, it, I think, facilitates perspective taking, at least in the way we do it. There's a component that is about experiencing, the world of the other individual through their eyes. Um, and so we do eyes on a little bit later in the day. Throughout the day, there are a lot of some of the more experiential metaphors, like when we're trying to understand diffusion, we use the limit exercise. But then we talk about very practical ways that folks can, facilitate diffusion and acceptance in their day-to-day life, such as taking a thought they're having, a recurring thought, something they're ruminating on or worrying on, and writing it down. Sometimes we do things like we suggest things like writing it backwards, writing it upside down, and then putting it in your pocket and carrying it with you. Could you carry that thought with you rather than trying to rid yourself of that thought before you get up and move on to the next task? We also do, and I failed to mention something that I think is pretty important. We also do develop a values / coping card that we end up laminating at the end of the day, and we invite them and encourage them to take with them and keep with them, keep on them. And so on one side, we have them actually write their unique values, their personal core values. And then on the other side are just some reminders of important concepts and important skills. So that's a piece. And then we also direct them to several apps for practicing mindfulness, Act Coach, Mindfulness Coach, and then some of the more mainstream apps, Calm, Headspace, things like that. And we kind of talk through those as well as other resources like books and YouTube videos and stuff that they can check out.
That is a pretty packed day. So lots of sort of hitting a lot of the ACT grade that sits there. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Evans, I really want to express my gratitude for having you with us today and giving us sort of a sneak peek of this really, I think, cool and important and potentially really impactful research that you're doing. And maybe once you get a little bit closer to the end of this project and have some data to share, maybe we can coax you to come back and give us an update.
I look forward to doing just that.
All right. Well, we heard it here, folks. We're going to hold it to them. So thanks again for joining us today, Dr. Evans, and thanks for everybody who has been participating. I know we didn't get to all your questions. I've captured as many as I can, and I'm gonna see if Dr. Evans and I can work to get those answered and maybe posted along with the recording of this webinar. So I'm going to hand things over to Mr. Norgard in just a moment. Anything you'd like to say before we wrap up today, Dr. Evans?
Thank you all so much for joining me today. I've already started getting some questions in my email, so please do feel free. If there wasn't something that I was able to address today that you would like to talk more about, and thank you all for your time and attention. Take good care.
All right, thanks again. So I'll hand things over to Mr. Norgard, who's going to tell you all about CEs.
All right, thank you everyone, and thank you for an awesome presentation, Dr. Evans. The next step is just logging right back into your account. That's the My Account page where you clicked Launch Webinar. Now, once you've returned to that page, you should, once we close, give it a couple seconds, hit refresh, and then you should see the orange certificate button. Click on that orange certificate button, complete the evaluation, and print out your certificate. If for some reason it states that your seminar is not complete after about 2 hours, go ahead, shoot me an email, and we'll go ahead and initiate the troubleshooting steps for that process. Otherwise, thank you for attending, and this webinar should be up for on demand within the next 48 hours. So thank you. If the presenters don't have anything else, we can actually just go ahead and close the room early so people can get started on their eval and print out their certificates.
All right, nothing more from me.
All right, well, thank you everyone, and have a good day.